In 1782, a Calvinist preacher's son left rural Cambridgeshire for London. His name was William Godwin. He had a simple aim and he believed in it. He believed in himself in a way that can only really be understood within the context of those times. He was a rational man and a rebel. He was going to bring about a more enlightened and just society, and in the process he was going to bring down all the political, social and religious institutions that stood in his way. The first great surge of industrialization brought a new kind of poverty and a new kind of wealth to the Western world. It also, of course, brought the printing press. Common people were better informed and were asking bolder questions than they'd ever asked before. This radical spirit was fed by a brilliant generation of essayists and pamphleteers, like Thomas Paine and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas found their ultimate expression during the summer of 1789, Paris, where a mob of the hungry poor brought down the French state. Of course, there is still a French state. Like his friend William Blake, Godwin believed in free love. Marriage, enforced monogamy, was something that restricted and thus corrupted human nature. He was against any hierarchical structure or organisation for the same reason. He was the first political anarchist. But his anarchism wasn't nihilistic. He believed in the perfectibility of humankind. He believed that people were innately good. In 1793, as the revolution in France reached fever pitch and began to slide into the terror, he published his great essay, An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. His central argument was that reason alone could deliver humankind into the promised land. One of the prerogatives by which man is eminently distinguished from all other living beings consists in his gift for reason. Make men wise, and by that very operation you make them free. Civil liberty follows as a consequence of this. No usurped power can stand against the artillery of opinion. This optimism, his belief in the inevitable triumph of enlightened liberal values over the old order, resonated with the times and made political justice immensely popular. In a sense, it laid the groundwork for all that's vital and good in political discourse today. Godwin's other great gift to the world was his daughter, Mary Shelley. Her great gifts to the world were Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. And this is where it all happened. This is Lake Geneva in Switzerland. It's amazing. You can see the whole geography of the novel from up here. To the west is Geneva. This is where the Frankenstein family lived and where Victor returned. When Victor was travelling home from university in Ingolstadt, he passed through Vevey and Lausanne and through the Alps of Jura that you can just make out on the horizon. It was in the Alps of Jura that he first met the creation and found out that the creation had killed his younger brother William. It was also in the Jura when he was a child that he first experienced an electrical storm, and this was a hugely significant event in his life. To the east is the Chamonix region in Mont Blanc. This is where Victor goes after the death of William and Justine, which he holds himself responsible for, and he finds solace in the mountains. It's also where he meets the creation for the second time, and where the creation tells Victor his own story. The small town just over the lake is Evian, and it's in Evian that the climax of the novel takes place. The creation tracks Victor down and kills Victor's bride on Victor's wedding night. Godwin married Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a fellow radical. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman and died 6 days after her daughter Mary was born. Reports of the carnage in France filter back, and the radical cause lost its momentum. Godwin mellowed with age, he moved to the country, he had ongoing money problems, and then he lost an argument. It was with a Scottish guy called Thomas Malthus. Malthus argued that if you get rid of inequality, poverty, injustice, war, famine, the population of the country would explode. He calculated that it would double in 25 years. Now, with this increased population, there would be more competition on resources, which would reintroduce the cycle of inequality, of poverty, of great wealth, of famine, of conflict. This is called the Malthusian argument, and it's an argument that Godwin couldn't counter. Frankenstein can be seen as Mary Shelley's response to the questions that her father asked. Is progress an end in itself? Is reason the way to enlightenment, to the perfection of society and man? And if not, what should we base our lives upon?
I think what you need to understand is that unlike the peasant or the aristocrat, the bourgeois chooses his own life. He has to invent himself. And indeed that is the modern condition. We start none of us with anything in particular, and our duty is to become ourselves. And the novel is the epic of that becoming. So to come back to Frankenstein, what happens in Frankenstein and in other Gothic novels is if the traditional novel is the dream of becoming. The Gothic novel is the nightmare of what happens when that becoming goes appallingly wrong. And it translates an anxiety which is intrinsic to the bourgeois state of being. The danger that one will reach too far. The danger that in inventing yourself, you're taking over the prerogative of God.
The first thing you need to be aware of with any work of literature are the structure of the work and the narrative perspective. These are the most basic decisions that the writers made. They're the underlying mechanics of the novel, and with Frankenstein they're both really interesting. In the vast majority of novels you have a writer figure who's not a character in the novel, but tells a story as if from above. In Frankenstein, Shelley takes that away. She has instead 3 first-person narrators. It begins with Robert Walton, who's stuck in the ice in the Antarctic looking for the North Pole. He finds Victor Frankenstein, drags him onto the boat, and Victor Frankenstein tells Robert Walton his story. So you have the second first-person narrative. Then later in the novel, Victor meets his creation in the Alps, and the creation tells Victor his story. So you have the creation story told verbatim to Victor, who remembers this 6 or 7 years later and tells Robert Walton, who records all in the ship's journal. You have one first-person narrative wrapped inside another first-person narrative wrapped inside a shipping journal. Robert Walton's a really interesting choice of narrator. He's basically a caricature of the romantic hero. He's a failed poet with delusions of grandeur who sets himself this task of finding the North Pole and deludes himself that it's for the benefit of humankind, when it's transparent that really it's for his own glory. It's essentially an egotistical, masculine endeavour, very similar to the one that Victor Frankenstein is on. So Robert Walton also acts as a kind of foil for Victor. The difference is that Robert survives. He doesn't make it to the North Pole. He turns back and he becomes a perfect messenger. And if the story itself is to be considered a warning, then Robert becomes the perfect person to preserve it for posterity. In terms of structure, the novel follows the basic structure of a quest narrative. And these are characterized by the fact that the beginning and the end are in the same place, in this case on Robert Walton's boat. Quest narratives follow a cyclical structure where the hero goes off on his journey, he overcomes many challenges, and in the process he acquires glory and self-knowledge, and then it goes back to the start. However, Shelley subverts his genre in many ways. Unlike in traditional quest narratives, Victor doesn't achieve victory and glory, though he achieves self-knowledge, finds that this knowledge leads him only to darkness and despair. So to summarize, we have a traditional quest narrative that goes wrong. It's told by 3 first-person narrators. The protagonist, Victor, the antagonist, his creation, and Robert Walton, who acts both as a foil to Victor and as an intermediary between the main characters and the audience. This is a very complex and evidently a well-thought-out style. The main weakness is that in places it lacks plausibility. For example, when you have the creations narrative, he speaks to Victor for 7 chapters. Victor is supposed to have remembered this and related it to Robert Walton 6 or 7 years later, who in turn wrote it all down verbatim. It's a bit flaky. Why does she do this? Well, there are 3 reasons really. Firstly, she's trying to create a sense of realism. By presenting the novel as a series of letters and journal entries, it creates the impression that this is real. If you have a third-person omniscient narrator, it's necessarily fiction. And this certainly supports her initial intention, which was simply to create something scary. The second reason is that first-person narratives are really good for writing very introspective, psychological prose, and this is what Frankenstein is really all about. The third reason is a wee bit more obscure. It's the idea that by having 3 separate first-person narrators, the reader is forced to contemplate different interpretations and different perspectives on events. She allows the reader to judge for themselves what the moral point of the story is. So does it work as a scary story? Well, not really. To get horror in prose, you need to have tension. And tension comes from foreshadowing and surprise. It has to be a really delicate balance. A good writer will give the subtlest of hints that something bad's going to happen, then gradually ratchet up the tension until it does. Now, partly because of narrative perspective, you know that everything's going to go badly wrong in Frankenstein. And because of Mary Shelley's style of writing, which is basically retrospective, you can anticipate with almost absolute certainty every single potentially scary event in the novel. So, It's dark, and some of the ideas in Frankenstein are terrifying, but as a scary read, it just doesn't work. So who is the creation? Well, to begin with, you can't even really say he was born. He was stitched together from different parts of various bodies and brought to life in Victor's lab. He has no name, no mother, no past, no identity. To begin with, he can't even tell one sense from another. He sees the moon but has no name for it. He is an unnatural monstrosity, and Victor is horrified by what he has created. This rejection of the created by the creator is the central concern of the novel. It links to Genesis via Paradise Lost, and also expresses Mary Shelley's own feelings of abandonment. By this point in her life, her own father, William Godwin, had disowned her. The creation is left to negotiate the world on its own. To begin with, it lives in a forest. It forages for food, learns about fire, but as winter comes in, it decides to go down to a village. It wanders straight into a hut and is beaten with clubs and forced to flee. It ends up living in a hovel beside the De Lacy family. This is a blind old man who plays guitar and flute and his son and daughter. It watches them all through the winter and spring. It notices that they're struggling, so it collects some firewood. It craves human warmth. He says, "My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. To see their sweet looks directed towards me with affection was the utmost limit of my ambition." But when he finally musters the courage to reveal himself to the family, he's again beaten and rejected. He flees for the high Alps. He says, "These bleak skies I hail because they are kinder to me than your fellow creatures." On the way, he saves a girl from drowning. Her companion shoots him in the shoulder. He is furious. His thoughts turn to his creator. The creation is an articulate, sensitive, and moral being, but his essential goodness is corrupted by these experiences. At the very end of the novel, he says to Robert Walton, "I, the miserable and the abandoned, am an abortion to be spurned at and kicked and trampled on. My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture, such as you cannot even imagine. It walks to Geneva. In a fit of rage, it kills Victor's younger brother William and frames Justine the maid. She is hung for the crime. Soon afterwards, it meets Victor in the Alps above Chamonix. It has a proposition for him, or rather an ultimatum. He asks Victor to create a female with all the same deformities. He promises that they will run away together and live in the wilds of South America, far from humankind but with each other. Victor will never hear from them again. But if Victor refuses his request, he says he will wreak such bloody revenge on Victor that he will regret ever having been born. After a long detour through England and Scotland and Ireland, Victor says no. The creation keeps its promise. In the second publication of the novel in 1830, it was watered down, and one of the changes was that the creature became less sympathetic and Victor Frankenstein became more so. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think in a sense it's Mary Shelley and of course in the 1830 text Percy Shelley himself had been involved in the rewriting, and it seems to me like a loss of nerve.
So what were her convictions
well,
that she lost?
These figures, these great young romantics, were extraordinarily radical thinkers, committed to radical change in society. Not just political change, although Percy was a fairly political figure and produced political verse, one of the few romantics to do that. But they were committed to changing the very way that people live together in the world. The rewriting serves a purpose of making, or attempting to make the novel less radical, more acceptable to the public likely to read it.
So which aspects of it do you think the public would have found unpalatable?
I think that reading it as a moral tale in which an ambitious but basically good person like Victor Frankenstein dares in the innocence of youth to do something which is beyond his scope, and then pays a tragic price for it. I think that is a kind of rather traditional moral tale that early 19th century society could accept without any trouble. And I think that there's a much more interesting, much more subversive reading of the text, which is possible and in fact is much more obvious in the original version, in which the tragic hero of the story is not Victor, but the creature. And in this reading, the novel becomes a kind of allegory for the position of all of us as creatures, human creatures of a creator God. And it presents the predicament of all of us, creatures created by our loving God, who then abandons us, who finds that we are not good enough, who creates us in such a way that we cannot be good enough, and rejects his creation. And that is exactly the creature's position. He's being rejected by Victor. And he's determined throughout the novel to make Victor face up to the responsibility of being his creator.
Yes.
And it seems to me that there is a very powerful, very subversive reading of the text, which is a criticism of traditional religion, that we should somehow feel guilty for being ill-created, whereas, we have no part in our own creation.
Yes.
The creature is not responsible for his faults. If anybody is responsible, Victor is responsible, and he should bear the cost of it, not the creature.
This is Villa Diodati in Geneva. It's the place where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Its original owner was a guy called Giovanni Diodati. He translated the Bible into French and Italian, and when he was at university, he became friends with John Milton. Apparently, Milton visited him here in 1639. Milton's Paradise Lost was a huge influence on Mary Shelley's novel and on the entire Romantic movement. The creation actually reads Paradise Lost, and it forces him to reflect upon the nature of his own existence. The fact that both Mary Shelley and John Milton stayed here, albeit almost 200 years apart, is just one of those amazing quirks of literary history. Now we're going to go inside. In 1816, Mary Shelley spent the summer here with her husband Percy, her half-sister Claire Clairmont, the poet Lord Byron and his personal physician. It was famously the year without a summer. A huge volcanic eruption in Mount Sumbawa in Southeast Asia blocked out the sun. So who were these people? Well, an enterprising hotel owner down below actually installed a telescope on his balcony so that his guests could observe the leak of incest, as he called it. He wasn't that far from the truth. Lord Byron was the son of Captain John Mad Jack Byron and the grandson of Vice Admiral John Foulweather Jack Byron. He inherited most of his money from an uncle who was simply known as the Wicked Lord. By the age of 14, Byron had written his first publishable poetry, but it was subsequently withdrawn and burned because of its amorous content. By 1816, he was already a famous poet. He'd had several homosexual affairs, which was a hanging offence at the time, and he'd been accused of sleeping with both his cousin and his half-sister. He'd been married and divorced and effectively exiled from England. He was 26 years old. Percy Shelley was also the son of aristocratic parents. He was an acolyte of Godwin, and his father had effectively cut off his money because he kept giving huge chunks of it away to charity in the name of political justice. He was already married when he met Mary Shelley. She was only 16. They used to meet secretly in St Pancras Cemetery in London at the grave of Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. Percy and Mary eloped and travelled around Europe together. They returned home disgraced and in debt. Mary was pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter who died a month after it was born. Then Percy's neglected wife Harriet committed suicide. Percy and Mary married and fled England with no plans of ever returning. Basically, when Mary Shelley lived here, she was depressed and traumatised. She was in the company of two debauched, free-loving libertines who would in the end turn out to be the greatest poets of their age. It was a really bleak summer. They'd spend a lot of time reading together and discussing the latest developments in literature and politics and science. They were particularly interested in the work of a guy called Luigi Galvini, who'd been able to demonstrate through his experiments the role that electricity plays in muscle movement. With electricity, he'd been able to reanimate dead matter. They also read from a dusty old book of German ghost stories, and they decided to have a competition to see who could write the scariest story. After a sleepless night, Mary Shelley had what turned out to be her great idea. In the morning, she opened her notebook and, in the voice of Victor Frankenstein, she wrote, "It was on a dreary night in November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils."
Mary Shelley was, when she came up with the idea of Frankenstein, and really up until the publication of the novel, she was almost constantly pregnant or nursing a young child. So her own pregnancies, her own creations, I think are very important in the writing of the novel, and that's something that critics have given more importance to recently. The key moment, the moment that came to her in the waking dream that she describes in the introduction to the novel, is Victor confronted by his creation and this moment of horror, and then, as you say, his rejection of it and him running away. One way to read that is as a mother's confrontation with her newborn baby. And some critics have pointed out that the horrific description of the monster, his wrinkled skin, his yellowish skin, all that, in some ways resembles a newborn baby, and that Victor's horrified reaction is in a way an unmaternal reaction. And of course, Mary's own mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died a few days after Mary's birth as a result of giving birth to her. So without over-labouring the psychoanalytical biographical element, this must contribute to this feeling that birth and creation is intimately linked with death and loss. The number of children that she lost, just after birth. Again, this is really something. Frankenstein is a novel about birth and death, and the two are really close together in the novel, and so you can definitely see that in the life of Mary Shelley, that her own anxiety and fear and depression about the loss of her own children really goes into a lot of the key themes of the novel.
This behind us is CERN, the European Centre for Nuclear Research. It's only a 5-minute drive from Villa Diodati. Underground, right underneath us and stretching 25 kilometres to the Alps of Jura, is the Large Hadron Collider. This is a multi-billion-euro scientific experiment whereby a single photon is isolated and fired around the circuit. Another photon is fired in the opposite direction, and the aim is to create a collision at the speed of light. This is incredibly difficult to do. They are dealing with magnitudes of mass, speed and force that are virtually incomprehensible. This is the absolute frontier of science.
So what is it for? What's the purpose of these hugely expensive experiments? Well, from a practical sense, there isn't one. They're looking for something incomprehensibly small, so that they can find something even smaller, so they can find something even smaller, in these weirdly worded ontologies that seem hypothetical. CERN is the perfect symbol for our tendency to pursue knowledge without ever asking why. We're stuck with a basically chauvinistic assumption that this attempt to see into the heart of nature is unquestionably a good thing. And this is a central assumption that Mary Shelley challenges in her novel. Shelley is sceptical. She's able to empathise with this trait and describes it as something that's very human and therefore inevitable. But her novel shows how destructive it can be. Victor Frankenstein gives us an interesting personal insight into this theme. He says, "A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures which no alloy can possibly mix, then the study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting a human mind."
This idea that you find salvation, you find morality and values in close family relationships, in healthy, nurturing relationships. Does this make it a feminist novel, do you think?
I think it can be read as a feminist novel. I'm not sure if I would say it for that reason, but just that all these male characters can be read as allegories for female characters, that, you know, she's talking about motherhood a lot. So I would say, rather than saying that, you know, if Victor was a woman, he would have nurtured, I don't think that's what she's saying at all. I think by making him male, she's distancing him from the idea that mothers may not want to nurture. You know, she's acting out that fear of motherhood. Mm-hmm. So in a way, yes, she's saying nurture would be the best thing, but she's acting out what might happen if we don't act out. You know, the horror in some of our deepest, most difficult to admit reactions to the people we love. Mm-hmm, you know, mm-hmm. You can reject the people you love, mm-hmm. and then look what happens. Victor comes from this, you know, perfect family, mm-hmm. you know, who all nurture each other like anything, and there are close family ties, and everything is wonderful. And yet he's still, you know, he's brought up according to all the ideals of, you know, and educational ideals, and he still creates this monster. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that I would call it reactionary. I think it's more like all the best fiction. It's really a what if, you know, it's exploring the extremes of possibilities of that may happen to characters, no matter what their origins. You know, Victor's origin with his happy family, kind of Garden of Eden in a way, you know, perfect childhood, compared to the creatures, imperfect childhood. And yet they both end up in the same place as aspects of the same character. Mm-hmm. You know, one is totally loved, one is completely unloved. Mm-hmm. And they both end up chasing each other across the Arctic Circle. You know, they're both driven to those ends. So she explores different trajectories, I suppose, different damage trajectories.
The Enlightenment is founded on the idea that everything is knowable. Mm-hmm. And that knowledge is approached completely rationally, scientifically. So it's an incredibly important movement in the history of ideas. And most of, as it were, the scientific side of our society, the technological side of our society, is descended from those Enlightenment, those rational ideas, that the world can be understood scientifically through facts, through the observation of facts and processes. Victor is very much a creature of the Enlightenment. This is a romantic novel, and one of the things I think that makes it probably wrong to think of this romantic novel as being the tragedy of Victor is that in this quintessentially romantic novel, Victor would be out of place as the hero because he's not a romantic soul. He's an Enlightenment soul. Victor believes that with the application of rational science, the world can be made a better place.
Like Godwin.
Like Godwin, absolutely, of course. I mean, that's, you know, it's one of the ways that you can see that Romanticism is more than just a rejection of the Enlightenment. The Romantics, who didn't call themselves Romantics, the term dates from at least 50 years after they disappeared and was probably popularized by Ruskin more than anybody else. The Romantics did not see themselves as rejecting the Enlightenment. They saw themselves as correcting the Enlightenment. What they understood is that after 50 years of Enlightenment thinking, it became apparent, at least to some people, that something crucial was missing. That there were whole areas of human experience that were either not being addressed by the Enlightenment, or that were not being improved. So the scientific understanding of the world was not making the plight of the poor any better. Indeed, quite the reverse.
And isn't that the case today?
Absolutely. And it is perhaps in the very failure of the Enlightenment to understand the intuitive side, the spiritual side of the human condition, that Victor fails. Particularly that he fails his creature. because he sees his creature as just a material object.
Doesn't he? Yeah.
Whereas the creature is a human being. He is completely a human being. And what the creature yearns for from Victor is attachment, is emotional attachment.
Yes.
And Victor completely fails to provide that for him because the creature is just something that he's made.
Yes.
And something that he can unmake if he wants to.
Yes.
But he can't, because life is never just material. That's what Shelley's novel is telling us. And in that, in the creature's obstinate refusal to accept this wholly material place that Victor has presented him with, in his obstinate desire to be accepted as a spiritual being, he is magnificent.
This is clearly a rejection of William Godwin's utopian belief that reason and progress must inevitably lead us to the promised land. It's also a riposte to the egotism of the men in Mary Shelley's life. So what does she propose as an alternative? The answer seems to be in the expression simple pleasures. And in this, in nature, Frankenstein's a dark, dark novel. However, throughout this tale of darkness and alienation, murder, revenge, there's this one consistently positive force. To the romantic imagination, nature was something sublime and transcendental. But for Mary Shelley, it was really just something that healed. After Victor's made his creation, he falls into a deep depression. He talks about how he raved incessantly. Then he says, "I remember the first time I became capable of observing outward objects with any kind of pleasure. I perceived that the fallen leaves had disappeared, and that the young buds were shooting forth from the trees that shaded my window. It was a divine spring, and the season contributed greatly to my convalescence." Then later, after the deaths of William and Justine, he gives this brilliant description. He says, "Fear overcame me. I dared not advance, dreading 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, although I was unable to define them. But then, I remained 2 days in Lausanne in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake, the waters were placid. All around was calm, and the snowy mountains were not changed. By degrees, the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Geneva." This same dynamic happens again and again in the novel. When Victor's walking in the Alps, he says, "These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. Alas, why does man boast of sensibility superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows." Victor's last words to Robert Walton are, "Seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition." This is Mary Shelley's message. This is what the fall of Adam, a recurring motive in the novel, really means. She shows us that the act of creation should be a natural thing that brings us closer to who we really are and to the people in our lives. She also warns us how important it is that we love and nurture that which we have created. Victor goes north and rents a cottage on an uninhabited Scottish island, wherein he plans to make the female companion for his creation. The creation follows him north and looks in to check on his work. But when Victor sees him, he's so horrified by what he's created that he abandons the whole project. The creation swears he's going to have his revenge, and he promises Victor that it'll happen on his wedding night. Victor's always been in love with his half-sister Elizabeth. He goes back to Geneva and they get married. Then they go for their honeymoon in Evian. Victor, being basically a self-obsessed prat, assumes that the creation's going to try to kill him. So he sits up all night with a gun while the creation sneaks into Elizabeth's room and strangles her. This is the climax of the novel and the beginning of the pursuit. Victor's father hears that Elizabeth has been murdered. He dies of shock. The creation has kept his promise. He's killed everyone that Victor has ever loved. In the end, they are both as alone as each other. Victor is full of hatred. He follows the creation northwards, and the creation leaves little clues to help him along the way, and thus begins this desperate animalistic pursuit. Victor has nothing else that he believes in except revenge. The creature has nothing to connect him to this world except his creator. They end up in the North Pole, and this is where they encounter Robert Walton in his boat.
After telling Robert Walton his story, Victor dies of fever and exhaustion. Then the creation shows up. He too gives Walton an explanation, and he says that, with Victor gone, all he has left to do now is die. He tells Walton that he's going to keep walking northwards as far as he can. He's going to find the most remote spot on earth. He's going to gather all the wood that he can find, build his own funeral pyre, lie on it and set it alight. Mary Shelley finished writing Frankenstein in 1818. She published 500 copies anonymously, and it was an underground sensation. In 1830, she properly published a really watered-down version of the novel. She began this process that's been happening ever since. In the popular imagination, Frankenstein's just a dumb monster with a bolt through his neck, and no one can really remember the name of the mad scientist who created him. Percy Shelley died in 1822 in a boating accident off the coast of Italy. He was cremated on the beach by his mates, including Byron. Mary had 4 kids to Percy, only one of them survived. She returned to England. She made peace with her father, who encouraged her independence and was really proud of her writing. And she tried to live as quiet a life as possible, writing, staying solvent, editing her husband's poetry and bringing up her son. She'd said her piece, and that's what literature is all about. I'm Roddy, and these are your notes on Frankenstein.
So sweet, going fast to hit the sky. Lord, I love it.